Welcome to this quick video where we're going to be exploring a really cool tool that I've recently discovered, and that is Codota. Basically, Codota is a coding assistant that runs in the background as I'm coding and will serve up highly relevant content and suggestions based on, basically based on the entire open source ecosystem. So let's code through a simple example here with the goal of consuming this REST API that you're seeing here. We're going to be using a standard HTTP client library. We're going to use OkHttp, but any client should work perfectly fine. And as you can see on the screen here, the API we're consuming is exposing information about books. Incidentally, this is built with Spring Data REST, so you can certainly run the project and code your way through the consumption part, as I will be in a second. But the goal here is to really show how Codota is able to predict the code as I'm working on it. So that's pretty cool. Let's jump right in and let's get started. Alright, so we don't really have a lot prepared here. Just a very simple main application, as you can see, and this book resource using Lombok to get rid of the boilerplate. So nothing too complex, just this simple domain mapping to the structure of the book API. Okay, so let's start by defining a simple book here that we're going to basically be trying to retrieve. And the very first thing we're going to do to try to consume the API is we're going to create a request. And as soon as we do that, we now start seeing Codota. This is basically the point where we're starting to see how Codota can give us solid suggestions. Things that basically I would have to spend time researching otherwise, right? Reading the documentation, reading a quick start guide, reading something to start understanding exactly how OkHttp works, especially if you're working through a new library, where, for example, you don't really know exactly how to create a request with OkHttp, so you would have to look it up. Well, that is exactly where Codota shines. You get a suggestion of what you want to do here, but the interesting thing here is that it's not just a suggestion. This is the right suggestion, which is really cool. All right, let's have a look at what Codota suggests. So Codota basically understands that OkHttp will require a builder, it will require naturally a URL, so it gets that variable created as well, which of course it's up to us to define, but it creates this correct way of creating the request, which is super cool. Okay, let's get this defined. This is where we have our API running, and remember, we're only consuming a single book, so let's add a single ID here in the URL so that we are just retrieving the book by its ID, and that happens to be ID 1 here. Okay, so let's see another powerful aspect of Codota here, and that is what it thinks that the next step is here without any sort of prompt from us. Because remember, in the initial example, I created the request and then I allowed Codota to suggest something. Well, now let's see what Codota thinks the next step should be without prompting it, without giving it anything else to go on. So clearly, Codota thinks that we need a response next, which makes perfect sense, right? We want to get to consume the API and get to a response. So let's pick that. We can pick the response, or we can actually pick the full line here, which again happens to be the correct thing that we want to do. That's really what's powerful about Codota. Is not just that it gives us suggestions, right? IntelliJ does that anyway. Any IDE will give us suggestions, but no IDE will give us solid, correct suggestions. That's really the cool part about this tool, is that these suggestions are actually what I would end up coding myself. What it basically does is it's smart enough to allow you to explore this library intelligently based on what you're actually coding, which is, well, it's new. It's never been done before, at least not that I'm aware of. Now, the other interesting thing here is notice that it's created this OkHttp client. It recognizes that in order to send a request, we need an HTTP client, so it gets the variable created, But the cool part here is that the tool should be smart enough to actually go backwards and hopefully, there we go, understand how to create a client as well, which of course in this case is pretty simple. Now, before we go further to process the response, we definitely need to check if this was successful, right? How do we do that? Well, first of all, let's actually have a look what IntelliJ gives us as a suggestion. Nothing really useful here. We get the option to use the building blocks that we've created, but we don't really get an intelligent next step here. So let's switch to Codota. And there we have it. This is what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to verify if the response was successful. And if it's not successful, it even gets the negation right. Well, in this case, we're just going to return. Obviously, just returning is not going to fly in a production-grade application, but in here, we're perfectly fine just returning and finishing up the execution. All right, so now that we're here and we know that the request was successful because we've just checked that it was successful, now let's extract the book resource that we got back as a string. As always, the suggestions are spot on, right? The very first suggestion is exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to extract the body as a string. Let's get our book resource initialized. And now what we want to do is we want to populate this with the information from the response. Now, in order to do that, we need to get that information out of the source string. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply map that with a JSON object. At this point, it kind of goes without saying that this is the right thing to do. So there you go. Actually, it is still worth pointing out just how different coding is with Codota running in the background. You can see that as I'm working through this example, just how useful the tool is. Okay, now let's use the book JSON and get the ISBN out of it. And let's do exactly the same thing for the title. All right, looks like we are done here. Let's actually put a breakpoint here and let's debug. Let's make sure that this actually is running correctly. So what I'm expecting at that point, at the breakpoint, is I am expecting the fully populated result. Let's have a look here. So we get the result and there we have it. We have the ISBN set. Of course, now we can step over and we'll get the title set as well. So there we are. A crazy useful tool to have running in the background as you're just working on your own project. All right, there's actually one more thing I want to show you with Codota. Let's close off the example here and let's have a quick look at a new feature that they've added recently, and that is this get relevant examples here. So the interesting thing is that as you write, Codota learns, of course, from what you're trying to build, and the suggestions that it gives you are based on that learning. They're based on what you're building. And so are these relevant examples here. So for example, let's do that for the JSON object. So there we go. We get these nice examples here that give us practical usage of that particular class or that particular piece of code and how that's used. So that is quite helpful as well. All right, hope that got you excited about Codota. It definitely got me excited because it's such an ambitious tool that's actually delivering and is highly useful right now. And given the speed with which the team is moving, it's only going to get better. Okay, read about it more on the site, ping me in the comments if you have any questions, and happy coding.